Uh, there we go. Perfect. Okay. Welcome to week 4. We'll be doing a lot of interesting topics today. Excited to see your mini homework presentation as well. So let's jump into it. So we'll have homework recap by Denise and Rachel. And then today we'll be doing static versus non-static, instantiation, some object-oriented classes, constructors, the delving deep in the developer docs, and then we'll talk about homework for next week. So I think I saw Rachel here. I don't know if Denise is here, but
I'm here as
Rachel.
well.
Oh, here you are, Denise. Perfect, perfect. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing and turn it over to both of you. Whoever would like to go first.
Thank you. So I'll be honest, I did not get far at all. I don't have much to show except like a few lines of code. So I wasn't sure what to do. Like, should I just let Rachel go ahead, or I don't really have like much.
I mean,
Like
if you
maybe
want,
3 lines.
you can show the little you have. It's okay.
Okay.
We're all learning, and then Rachel maybe can take up and help you on the parts to continue.
Okay.
Yeah, up to you, Denise.
All right, let me get it set up then real quick. Sorry, I should have had this set up.
No worries. I guess while we're waiting on Denise, how did everyone do on the homework? How do we feel about this week? Good. Any frustrations? That good, huh?
I think I need to slow down when reading the instructions because I put my trigger, that old new, or I put it in the trigger rather than in the class because I was just going so fast, but otherwise it's starting to click. And Bonnie, thank you for the test class that you threw into my gist for running it on your own. That helped me because test classes still elude me. So
awesome. Yeah, I figured I would let you see how I was checking what you had given us and see if that might get you thinking about it sort of next steps.
It definitely helps. So thank you.
Awesome.
Okay, can you see my screen yet? Did I share it?
No, I don't
Not
see it
yet.
yet.
Okay. Let me try again. Oh, sorry, it was a security and privacy thing. All right, let me try again. There we go. Now the exclamation points are gone. Okay. So I didn't get very far. I was able to create a trigger in VS Code, and I was looking at the account trigger handler, but I did not get to the handler. So I was just trying to understand how to set up the trigger, knowing that it had to be on the lead and it was an after insert and after update. And then taking a look at some of the trailhead, one of the trailhead pieces that had multiple pieces like that with after insert and after update to see how to set it up. And that's pretty much where I stopped.
Okay, so it looks like you did start the trigger. You don't have the, let's say, the logic inside to call that class yet.
Mhm.
But, just like as we discussed, just take some time and really like look into the code and stuff there, and then follow back up. You can just update this just when you get more through the assignment.
Okay. Sounds good.
Alrighty, I think then we'll switch to Rachel.
Yes, ma'am. Let's go.
Oh no, don't call me ma'am.
Habit. I call everybody ma'am.
No worries, no worries. It's like, oh,
I'm one
Okay.
of those people too, just FYI.
It's just
Don't
it's
ma'am
just
me,
in there.
please don't ma'am me.
yeah, I just like, oh, is my age showing? Okay.
Oh God, no. Okay, so I hope this
I
isn't
love
frowned upon.
that your VS Code has the the trigger in purple.
Yeah, I kind of like that too. Yeah, I've been working in Dev Console instead of VS Code just because I'm more comfortable with it, and I found that I was able to work a little faster with troubleshooting when I could just quickly narrow it down straight to the debug statements and everything. So I'm not in VS Code for this. So and also I was telling Denise earlier when we were trying to get stuff started, writing everything. I was able to kind of steal the basic structure out of a different project in one of my other sandboxes. So I feel like this is like Frankenstein monster code because it's kind of pieced together from some other things. But so I have in the trigger, I have different sections written out for if it's after the insert or after the update. That's how it was written in the one that I stole from another sandbox. I left it because it kind of made sense to me, like, oh, I could see that being helpful for future requirements. You know, if you had to build something else out, this might save you from having to rewrite everything later. Don't know if that's correct, but that was my thought process. So if it's after the insert, it's got this little guy. I wasn't confident if this was the right way to do it because this part, we're trying to keep most of the bulk of the code in a handler class or something. But from what I could find online, doing this thing so that way it only fires under certain conditions, all I was finding was code on how to do it in a trigger. So down here in the after insert part of the trigger, I have all this set up to see if the product interest field has changed. So like I said, I'm not sure if this is the most best practicey way to do it. This is just like all I could find. So it's basically creating a map and checking out, okay, what's the old value of the product interest field and what's the new value, and is it different? And if it is different, add it to the list, and then we're actually calling that list into the trigger instead of just like all of the leads that potentially were pulled by the trigger.new.
Okay, yeah, just to give like a little hint here. So normally what you'll do, and you're like on the right track, you would send that old map and new map to your class as parameters in the method, and then you'd basically do the same logic that you're doing. So you're like just a couple steps away.
Okay. But you would still do some of it, it sounds like, in the...
Yeah, you can just do all this logic that you're doing right here. You can do all of it in the class. So where you're accessing the old map, you have the new value, and then you're checking against both, and then you're saying, okay, add these and do the update.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
In the handler, this is something that I kept it in here just kind of as a reminder. Bonnie helped me out with this in the, I'm not sure if it's gist or gist, but I hadn't realized that I was making a redundant list. I kind of forgot that it was making a list here. So after I saw her comment over the weekend, I edited out what I had written, and now it's working, so yay. So basically I have the list of leads. I'm creating a list to hold the tasks in. And then for that list of leads, create a task. Here's what the subject should be. And then these weren't included in the instructions necessarily. I was just kind of thinking bare bones, okay, what would I want on a task? Add these tasks to my task list. And then if there are any tasks in that list, insert them into the system. And then my little debug log.
Yeah, so the same way how you passed in this method, how you pass the trigger value using your list lead, you would just pass two values, your old value and new value for the other part.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And
yeah,
then
overall, this looks good.
okay.
You can go to the next part. I'm just
Okay.
looking at it. Yeah.
I did a test. I only did it for like half of the thing. I just simply ran out of time. So I did create a test for if it is inserting brand new leads. So again, I have a list. I created like the only chef people I could think of, Paul Hollywood and Gordon Ramsay. So they're my new leads. Insert them into the system, and then created a list to hold those IDs. So then I could plug them in and make these tasks. And then I have a system debug and a system assert to verify that the tasks got created and the right number of tasks got created. And then I also had different product interests in there just to make sure that, a little bit of variation to make sure that everything was working. I had hoped to maybe have time to go back and also write out a test for doing the update. I just didn't have time, so we have half a test.
Yeah, and I mean, for all of these gists that we do week to week, you can always go back and do an update on them.
Sure.
And let us know if you want us to look at it. But yeah, this first piece of your test class is looking really good. One just thing to think about is for this one, you're just testing two leads in that list. But, if you want to do more bulkification to create more leads, just so you're really testing the bulk of your trigger.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Any frustrations, any aha moments while doing this work?
Probably the biggest aha moment was probably just simply getting Bonnie's help and figuring out why it wasn't working, because I tested it out a few times and it wasn't doing anything. It wasn't throwing me any errors, but nor was it creating the tasks. And so I was going, okay, there's something wrong somewhere. And I kept looking at things and kept kind of messing with little things that I thought it could be, and still nothing. So it was helpful to see like, oh, it's just okay. So that was I was really pleased when that's all it ended up being, and now it's working. So really, any frustrations were more not related to this class. It's just the company I work for is right in the middle of this huge project, and then I'm actually moving to a new job in a couple of weeks. So it's just kind of one of those like, there's a lot of things happening right now, but it's so I'm trying to think like in the scope of things, really, this was almost a relief from having to not have to work on the other stuff that's going on right now.
Well, I hope code can always be your relief. That always makes me happy when people say this is their relief.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Cool. Overall, good job, Rachel. Good job, Denise. I will take back sharing or attempt to share. See. Okay. I see the green bar, so I'm hoping everything's looking good. All right, let's start our group learning. So what's the difference between static versus non-static methods? And I'll call on, let's see who I see, Natalie.
It's how you instantiate the class. So if you're like referencing an object or not, in a static, you can only have those variables essentially within that class or that method. Whereas non-static, you obviously don't have to.
All right, what about you, PJ?
I think static, it's kind of like you can reference directly without like instantiate. the value. Non-static, I think you have to instantiate every time, but the value can change. But static, the value doesn't change.
Yeah, so both you and Natalie saying the same thing, or you read the slides ahead, but yeah, so static you reference directly without creating an instance of a class. And when we say instance of a class, we're essentially creating a copy of that class. So when I think about like static and non-static as words, static is singular, it doesn't change. And non-static is just telling me, okay, I'm making a copy of this. So there's only one me walking around, static, but there's many people being copied as their parents are having kids, non-static. So if we look at static here and we have a little class to look at, if we see that helper methods that adds number. So static can reference directly without creating an instance of a class. So here we're doing helper methods, which is a class. And then you can see that it has public static integer add numbers. It's taking some parameters that we're not worried about, and then it's returning the sum. So we're directly going to call this class helper methods that add numbers, and we're going to pass it 3 and 4. It's going to do its magic, and it should send us back 7 if it's calculating correctly. So can't access a class variable or anything outside itself. So in this sample, you wouldn't be able to access the static methods with your private reference variables. And then if we look at non-static, it's a copy of the class. We instantiate an instance of the class. So if we look at this flowers.cls class, and we see that we have some integers, and then we have our constructor that's taking those integers, and the string, and setting the value, and then we have a public void wilt. So on instantiation, you can seed with variables. The wilt method modifies class variables. So in this one, what we would do to call this is we would say flower flower class variable equals new flower class. And then from there, we would be able to use our wilt method. And all this method is doing is decreasing, so removing one petal. So if we were to pass carnation flower, we would decrease a petal from our carnation. I don't know how I feel about decreasing petals from the flowers, but we'll go with the example. So now the difference between static versus non-static variables. If we're thinking about static and non-static variables, what's the difference? And I will call on Janae. You're muted. I think I see you talking. Yeah, you're muted.
It's muted when I'm not supposed to be. And okay, so for static, it exists only once in your code, and non-static exists in each instance of the class you declare. I mean, I'm seriously just going off the side because I don't know, but that's what I found. Okay. So,
I love the honesty and that y'all are reading the slides before.
cool.
So yeah, so if I were to ask you to make a static variable where you only wanted to exist once, can you think of a method or variable that we've used where it's been static or non-static? I'll put that out to everyone.
Thank you.
There's certain classes, and I'll show examples of them, but there's certain classes we use, system classes, that have a mixture of both static and non-static. But if none come to top of mind, it's okay. Okay, I see a little shake head, so I'll continue on. But yeah, basically static exists once in your code, and then non-static exists in each instance of the class you declare. So every time you declare that class, you're creating copies and copies and copies of it. So what does it mean to instantiate a class or an object? And I will go with Kavita. You look quiet today.
So I think it means that you create like a copy of that class with like a fresh bunch of variables that you can then use in that when you call that particular class. You make it an object, basically.
Exactly. And so we'll look at, and we'll go into some sharing here, but like, let's look at this date systems class. The date is an abstract constructor, and we'll actually open up the date class itself. But we have where we can create an instance of a date, and it's date my date equal date dot new instance, and we can set it. So what we're doing is we're using this new instance method, and we're setting the date to September 15, 2019. So we'll see from this signature, if you can see at the bottom, it's public static date. So when you set a date in this method, it won't change because we're saying that it's a new instance, but it's going to be static because our signature has static in it. So whatever we set year, month, day won't change. And if we look at going on, so September 15, 2019, that is what my date will equal to. But we can also say, here's a non-static method where we're saying my date that add days. So this method, add days, whatever date we set initially, it will just add 3 days. So this one is non-static. Now, I have a trick on figuring out some of these system classes. So let me switch over to, let's see, make sure I'm not skipping the slides before I switch over. Okay, we talk more about the date class. I'll just switch over to the slides now. So in the I put a link to the date class in the slides, I think on slide 14. But basically, when we're looking at these different date classes and we're looking at the methods, we don't need to remember if that method is static or non-static. All we need to do is read and see what the signature of the method is. So for example, if we look at that new instance one that we just sent, we can see that the following example, we can also see that the signature is static. So we know that what it's expecting, what it's returning, and then what we can do is to test it out to make sure everything's good. And hopefully you can see my developer console. Yes. Perfect. Okay. I'm just going to demo in Dev Console today so that we can get those debugs. But if we look at this date and we're going to set, let's do today, 2021, 3, 22, and then we'll throw a system debug in there. Apologies if my keyboard is a little loud. So let's look at what that looks like. We should get today's date, and I'll zoom in a little bit here. So we should get today's date. But as we saw in the example, we can do things like add non-static methods to this. So if we say my date, and let's pick another method that we know. So we can say, let's see, we have like month, so we can figure out what the month is. And usually in the developer guide, you will have little sample code that you can just use to practice, which is really good. So we know that this type is integer because it's returning an integer, but also we can see that its signature is just public integer. So we know that this is a non-static, a copy, it will change. So if I say my date, and my copy skills are not the best today. So if we say integer.date, and system debug. We expect the date to be, instead of date, we'll just say month. We expect the month to be March because we know we set the date. But it depends on who initially changes that static method, because someone can come in and say, oh, no, actually the date is next week. And so that would change what we're doing. Let's just highlight this one. So we should see March or 3 because that's the month. And we're expecting an integer value. Any questions on this? So there's tons of methods in here and they all do different things. So you can always check the signature. And from the signature, you can always tell if it's static, meaning it's once, it will only happen once, or non-static. So is leap year is always a good one to check. There's always weird things that happen on that leap year where you have to account for the day. So this is always a good method to keep in hand. And with these system classes, they're already built in. So no need to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes when you're working with date, maybe you need to work with a specific format. Especially if you're working with an org where the date's written differently, right? Depending on the locale. That's always good because if you set the date on a specific year and that month is say like 0101, then it's okay, but it gets kind of tricky when it's like 0305. Which one did you mean? Did you mean March 5th or May 3rd? Any questions on static versus non-static?
So just so I'm clear, so you can basically take a static and turn it into non-static, like there on the screen, the public signature, the format parentheses, like the day string. So you start off with an, date, my date equals date.new instance. So that one's static. And then you're turning it into non-static with the
other method.
The other method. Okay.
Yeah. So this first one is static because if I change this date right now, I don't control the copy that is happening down here. So for example, if I change the month to April, my non-static that doesn't get changed, my static one, this non-static one will change based on what is happening here. So if you're thinking about running code in your orgs, if you set the date specifically for today, but someone comes in and they don't know why the date is now in the past and they change the date, you might have code that's based on, okay, on this specific day and time, this thing needs to happen. Like maybe you're using it as a base date where anything past this day, we should execute this logic, and anything before that, we should execute this logic. But you have to be careful when it comes to like static and non-static, because again, if you don't have like say comments and you have that static set, you know that, okay, I'm using this specific date as a differentiator, but someone might come in and say, oh, let me add like a week to this because it's in the past, which is like the non-static of it.
We're going to see more examples of this as we go on as well.
Yeah.
If
So
it's still a little murky, because it's a tough topic.
yeah, so I'll turn it over to Bonnie, but the biggest thing to think about is when you're thinking of static, it's a one-time that happens, and non-static is your copy.
Okay, hopefully you're seeing my developer docs for the date class. Thumbs up if that's what you're seeing. Awesome, thank you. Like I said, it's been a tough technology couple of days. Things have been going wrong. What I did in this date class documentation in the Apex Developer Guide, I just did a search for public date, because the static methods have public static date or whatever is returned. So I thought, gee, which ones aren't static? Can we take a quick look at that? And I found add days, add months, add years. All of those are things that you can't do if you don't have a date to add it to. So it makes sense that you have to have an instance of a date before you can add days to that instance of a date. And yeah, I could totally rewrite that to be a static method, a utility class that says take a date and a number of days and add that number of days to that date and return the value. But instead, what we've said is we're going to give all the power to the object itself. Let's take that date and compute the how many days to the start of the month, basically. Returns the first of the month for the date that's been given, or in this to start of the week, returns the start of the week for the date that's given. Has to be given a date. So rather than create everything as a static method, we can take advantage of object-oriented programming, and we can say, let's give the power to the object. A date should have the ability to give us information about how far it is to the start of the month, or how far it is to the start of the week, or what would be the next date if I added days or months or years to the given date. It's different than functional programming, where everything just sort of acts on its own. And recipe cards are a really great sort of metaphor for object-oriented programming, because you have your list of ingredients and then you have your list of steps, and those things all go together to have the one expected outcome, a particular kind of cake or roast beef. Very different outcomes, similar steps, similar properties, but the outcome is going to be dependent on what that instance of that recipe is, right? If it's the instance of roast beef, you're not going to expect cake. So let's go back to our slides and talk about this a little bit more. In our second line of code here, what are we doing with the value of my date? And I will call on Rochelle.
I think you were just adding 3 days to the date instance you created. So the new date would be September 18th, 2019.
Awesome. Yeah, so simple. We had to know what the date was. We had to have that instance of the date in order to add 3 days to it. And this is really helpful if you have things like a close date and you need to calculate some number of days before or after the close date to do some additional action, right? It makes sense to say, hey, we're doing things based on the value of dates, so let's give the power of that functionality to that date, because that's where it makes sense, rather than trying to figure out where else to put it. Let's take a look at the string class, because it's similar in its ability to give us methods that are static and methods that are instance methods. In our first example, it says that we're creating a new instance of date, but you can see that we are not. We are creating a string, a simple string, and giving it a value. Then we take that variable that we've created, that string, and we apply the length method to it. I'm betting that the length method has to have a string in order to tell me the length. And sure enough, you can see that I've got my string.length here as opposed to simply string.length. So if we go back to our date example, we're here operating on date.newInstance, so static. And here we're operating on variable name.addDays. So clearly we need this instance of a date. We need my date. Likewise, in our strings, we're using my string.length here because we have to have that instance of a string in order to tell how long it is. If I were to ask you how long is that string, you're probably going to say to me, what string? Had I given you the string to begin with and said, how long is my string, you wouldn't have to ask that question. And your code's the same way. So that's why some methods are instance methods and some are static. Likewise, we're converting to capitalization. We're telling it right away, we're working with this string, capitalize it. So we're using an instance method in order to get the results that we're looking for. And this is all a great benefit of object-oriented programming, right? Is that objects can exist in and can encapsulate the functionality that makes sense to them. It makes sense for a string to be able to tell us how long it is and for it to be able to tell us what the capitalized version of it is. So those are instance methods. The list class, which is another Apex class that we're going to take a look at shortly. The list class is similar. We create a new instance of a list. We put it in the variable called myList. In this case, we're using an empty. We're not passing anything to it when we create it, so the constructor is empty. But we can still use our variable that contains an empty list, and we can add to it. So using the add method, and I will call on Pingjing to tell us if that add method is static or instance.
I think it's non-static.
Non-static, so instance, absolutely, because it starts with my list. It starts with a variable name. If it starts with a variable name, it's operating on whatever's in that variable. It's operating on that instance of a list. And so in this case, the operation that it's doing is it's actually adding values to that empty list, that empty collection. So now we've got something added to it. We've got another method here. It is the size method. And so let me call on Catherine to find out if that's a static or an instance method.
Also an instance.
Right. And how did you decide that?
Because it starts with the variable, so it depends on what is in that variable.
Awesome. Okay, well, we've got one more example, and I'll call on Chang to tell us about is empty. Do you think it's static or instance method?
It looks like it's instance method as well.
And you're saying that because?
It's because it's referring to the object or data type that was instantiated earlier.
Right. So this variable was instantiated earlier based on the data type of list. Exactly. So we've got this list of strings. We've called it my list. And my list, one of the methods associated with this specific instance is to know whether this specific instance is empty or not by running this instance method. Likewise, obviously, if it's not empty, then we would probably want to know its size. And it should be able to tell us that. That's an awesome property for this specific instance of a list of strings to be able to tell us. And obviously, if we ran that method, that instance method, on any other instance of a list of strings, it would give us a different result, right? Awesome. Let's take a closer look at the constructor for the list, because we touched on constructors just a bit last week, thanks to VS Code throwing those constructors in whenever you create a new Apex class. But you don't necessarily need the constructor, because Apex classes have a constructor that is understood. You don't have to explicitly define a constructor. These classes are always constructible. If they have instance methods, you don't have to add a constructor. An empty constructor is just noise in your code. But in this case, we're passing 3 strings. We know they're strings because they are contained inside of these single quotes, and that's what we do when we want to indicate that we have a string value. So we've got 3 strings. They're separated by commas, so that's how we know we've got 3 of them. And we're enclosing them in the braces in order to get them passed into the list of strings when we instantiate it as my list. So again, the vocabulary here is pretty massive and weird and something to get used to, but hopefully it's starting to come together a little bit. I'm going to bring up my VS Code so that we can look at the list class a little bit as well. I've pulled some code straight out of the documentation. We'll take a look in the documentation also, but let's take a look at it in VS Code first. Okay, so we've got our ability to create a list. We've done this many times in our code already. We're creating a list of integers with the brilliant name of ls1 because that's what was in the documentation. And it's going to be an empty list when it's first created because we're passing nothing at all to it. It still exists. There's still an instance of it. It just happens to be an empty instance. So we can add to it the number 1, we can add to it the number 2. Those then become 2 separate values in our list. Now, if I create another list, let's see, I've just done this one. Sorry, I copied the code from 2 different code blocks. If I create another list, ls2, instantiating it this time by passing in the first list that we created, then we can actually see that we get list 2 containing the same thing that was in list 1. Let's run this so that we can see if it makes sense to us. Okay, where did you put my results? There we go. And I will do a quick Control F debug to see what messages we ended up with. So we didn't debug the very first list. We've come in here, we've added 1 and 2, but we are debugging the second list. And sure enough, on line 10 of the code that we passed, we've got our debug statement, and it's showing us the values of 1 and 2, which is what we expected. So we can pass in a list as one of our constructors. We can also, in the next example, pass in a list of integers, same as we did before. And sorry, pulled these straight out of the documentation. They're actually the same. But let's take a look at the account one because it's truly interesting and confusing because they've chosen to mix the different ways of referring to a list. We know that in Apex, lists are arrays and can be written like arrays. Therefore, when you see account with the square brackets, it means exactly the same thing as list of accounts. So it could also be written like that. So list of accounts is the same as account array. In this example, we've got an account A that has a name and a billing city. We have an account B that is a new account, therefore it has no values, it's empty. And we can create an array or a list of accounts called Q1 that contains both account A and account B. Again, using our curly braces, again, separating out those multiple values with the comma in between and just putting in the variable name that we want. We can also create, because it's an S object, we can create a list of accounts by cloning an existing list. And let's run this and see what happens when we look at these two. Okay, so now we're going to debug our account code, hopefully. And it looks like it did not insert anything. What's going on here? Oh, we have system asserts rather than system debugs. Let's change that real quick. We want to do a system debug. And we want to show both of these values that we had. And see if they're equal by looking at them and inspecting them ourselves in the debug log. Okay. And now, hopefully, my debug is going to be more informative. Okay, and now we see, in fact, both of them contain the same billing city because the second one was clone of the first one. And the first one was set to equal to San Francisco in our code on line 40. Are there any questions about how this code is working? If not, I will actually go back to our list documentation and take a quick look at where all of this code came from. Again, I was just bringing it straight out of our developer doc. This is the, sorry for the scrolling. This is our Apex developer guide, which has all of its classes defined, and you can go into the list class documentation. You can see the constructors. So we can create an instance of a list class with those empty parens. We can create, based on our available constructors, a list of or collection by passing in a list. We saw that. We can actually create a list by passing in a set. And this is super important, because if you're going to be doing an insert, for example, you'll want to be using, or an update, you'll want to be using a list, but you might need to use a set to make sure that you dedupe that before you insert it. You can't use insert with sets, so you can convert your set to a list with a simple constructor. And we walked through some of the methods, or some of the sample code that they have here in the doc that demonstrate the various methods, as well as the constructors, including that clone method, as you see here. So feel free to come in here and grab the code just like I did, make some changes to it, paste it into your VS Code under the scripts. You can create your own week3.apex and store the code to refer back to, make your own comments as notes, and use that execute anonymous to highlight different code blocks and see how they run. Okay, I think we have some more slides to get through, so let's move on to the next thing. Okay, what we were looking at with the date class and the list class and the string class is that in Apex we have these various classes. System is actually a class as well, so we do system debugs, we do system asserts, but all of these different Apex classes can be instances, or they can have static methods. So when they're instantiated, that means that we're expecting the data to be able to give us information about itself. And that's all part of the object-oriented coding practice of encapsulation, that is, and separation of concerns. So if I'm a list, I should be the one and only thing concerned about how long I am as a list, or concerned about with whether I'm empty as a list. There shouldn't have to exist another class that figures that stuff out for me. I should just know that as a list. So that's what we're trying to do with object-oriented programming, and that's why we have instance classes. But sometimes it does make sense to say date.today, for example, and get that value assigned to the date without having to instantiate anything first. So that's the usefulness of static variables. They just go out and do a thing. They don't have to be instantiated first. I would encourage you to go through the list class, the date class, and the string class, and do things like look for where the word static exists in that signature definition and where it's missing. Pay particular attention to where it's missing to see if you can figure out why it makes sense to put that responsibility onto the instance of the object. Why does it make sense to put adding month or adding years onto the instance of the date? Because the date should be able to tell us that. Let's take a quick look at the string class while we're in here. And these string methods are worth reading through because the ability to manipulate strings is going to be a powerful way to transform data from one system to another. And we can do public string. It could be that it's returning something other than a string, but this is a really great, easy way to get at some of the methods that are instance methods. So we have the ability to return an abbreviated version of this string. Again, makes sense for me as a string to be able to be the one responsible for giving you the abbreviated version of me, rather than having to have another class be responsible for that. That capitalization, of course, the string should be able to capitalize itself. Finding the center of the string. And do we have any other good ones? We have a whole bunch down here. But here we have some Boolean. So we're just returning Boolean value instead of a string value. But again, it is a responsibility of the instance of the string to tell us if it contains ignoring case, some substring. So who should tell us if the string contains a bit of text? Well, the string itself should tell us. We shouldn't have to pass that string and the substring to some other class or some other method to give us that information. We should empower the class that we've got to tell us everything it knows about itself and to take responsibility for that. Deleting white spaces, obviously we want the string to be able to do that for itself. So hopefully you can read through these and get a sense of why some are static and some are instance. So if I do public static in my search, I get this escape single quotes and a string, and I have to pass it a string to escape. So this one isn't expecting my string to know how to escape its own single quotes. It's expecting that separate method to exist to say, how do I get the second and different string that has the escaped single quotes, which is good for the way we present data, particularly in integrations. And formatting the string in an entirely different way we can do, again, with a separate static method. For me personally, the date class has much clearer examples of static and instance, and it's much easier for me to see from an architecture point of view why they made the choices that they made. But the developer documentation is yours to explore and learn from. And there are a lot of different docs. We have our main hub for the developer community and platform information and Trailhead and blogs, which you should definitely be exploring and reading and learning from. And someone mentioned stealing code from someplace else, and I would encourage you to use that technique freely and openly and talk about it, because we all know that William Shakespeare, one of the most famous writers in history, got a lot of ideas from other authors, and people who study Shakespeare can look at the sort of trace back where different ideas came from. People don't create great work by sitting in a vacuum and ignoring what others do. People create great work by looking at what's great in what other people are doing or what's been done before, and learning from that and building on that and doing more with it. So please, please, please do that. Read other people's work. Grab code that you like from other places and learn from it and reuse it and build it out to suit your needs, starting with the developer docs. And at some point you're going to say, gee, I don't like the way they did that. I don't like the variable names that they used, for example, me personally, in our list examples. So, you know, at some points, you're going to become critical also of the code that you're reading elsewhere. And you're going to say, gee, maybe ls1 isn't the right name for this variable. Why isn't it integer list? Or something informative like that. Maybe something specific about what that integer, what those integers represent. So learn from it, critique it, figure out how to make it better and how to make it yours. Another place to look besides the Apex Developer Guide and the Developer Documentation Hub is the Stack Exchange, which is a community sponsored forum, if you will, for posting questions and responses. It can be a little bit macho sometimes, where everyone wants to one up the other guy's answer or dismiss something that wasn't written exactly as a question the way they wanted or written as an answer exactly how they wanted. So don't let that put you off. If you do jump in to any of the conversations, take it with a grain of salt if anybody comes back with that, and hang in there, because there's a ton of great information and some really great people who spend their time answering questions. And looking at questions and answers is also a great way to learn. So I encourage you to Google your questions, and when you see Salesforce Stack Exchange as an option, take it as a trusted site, and then test test whatever you find there to make sure that it's still applicable, because some things are marked the best answer and over time change. Our developer.salesforce.com website is super helpful with all the resources, getting started, Lightning Design System. The sample gallery is awesome. I encourage you to check it out. There's some sample Apex code that was added within the last 6 months or so from Kevin Porman, who is also a rad coach, so an incredible human being. And so tons and tons of good stuff out here. And of course, in the Apex Developer Guide, we're going to get that really awesome capabilities to learn more about how to use Apex for what we're trying to achieve. And the more comfortable you are reading that and grabbing the little code snippets and trying them out, the better off you're going to be. We also have, of course, our ability to traverse the table of contents here in the contents area, the search, which lets us put in terms and find how frequently and where that particular term comes up in the documentation. So you can search, for example, for SOCL and get both the SOCL and the dynamic SOCL documentation. You get all kinds of important notes and considerations and warnings, and just cannot say enough. I have it open all the time and am always reading it when I'm writing code. And we have already looked at the Apex docs. Is there anything else from the document list that you all were interested in checking out? We can come here. I kind of want to look at the recipes, if I can find it in the redesigned, slightly redesigned. I'll just Google it. Let's see. So there was a blog post a while back about Kevin's work, and he's got HTTP callouts and callout recipes, writing sustainable triggers, probably building on that example that we've read about previously, but you can see his code that he created. And let's see, do we have a little link? Oh, data transfer objects. I love those when I use flows. Somehow I have a feeling that none of this is pointing to the recipe page. But we have a trailhead on getting to know the Apex sample recipes. So even better, the learning just goes on and on. Instructions that walk you through it and can verify the step in your playground. And you can even deploy the sample recipe app. And here's the sample gallery. Well, somewhere here is the sample gallery. Okay, from the Learn menu, I will look for I've already left it. They're not making it easy for me to do this as a demo. Sorry about that. From the Learn menu, there's my sample gallery. And we've got Lightning Web Component recipes and Apex recipes right below that. If you're doing Marketing Cloud, there's some AMP demos and Lightning Web Component open source, Visual Force to Lightning Web Component, automation components, so how to use Lightning Web Components and Flow and invocable actions and kind of combine all of the things that you're interested in combining. So totally take some time to check all of that out and see it. Hopefully you'll see it all as opportunities to learn and experience more and improve your own coding by looking at what others are doing. For this week's homework, we're going to have you creating a trigger and a trigger handler for the recipe object. Hopefully you're going to be comfortable doing that. We were playing with triggers this past week and trigger handlers. In Trailhead, we're going to assign you creating classes and objects, and then there is some reading. And I would like to open this week's homework and just make sure that we have it well understood. So we're going to be doing coding practices with more triggers and handlers. And it's fun to watch people edit. I encourage you to grab this, paste it in this comment so that you can kind of follow your requirements as you're building out your code, and create a method that will be called before a recipe is inserted or updated. That's an example of one of the requirements that you need to meet. So good to put into the comments directly in your code. So we're going to need to have a before insert trigger in our context, right? Because it says that we have a method that's called before the recipe is inserted or updated. Oh, so before insert and before update. We also want to rate the complexity of the recipe. So we want to create a method that checks before the recipe is inserted or updated, and calls out to the helper function class called rate the recipe complexity. So we'll take a look at that in just a minute. And we want, after the recipe is updated, if it's not a draft and it's being used in any cookbooks, we want to create a review task. And the various steps for that, what that review task how that should be done, are here as well. So we also have our reading. Take a look though at that class. It was handle helper functions. Our helper functions class, and the complexity is the one that we're going to be taking a look at in the homework. And there's a to-do listed right here in the comments already. We want to consider the number of ingredients, and we want to make sure that we're bulkifying the code when we do that. So this code is currently just a system debug, but we want it to consider the number of ingredients in a given recipe that's passed into this method and determine whether it's rated as complex based on the number of recipes or the number of ingredients, excuse me. And if the recipe has an active time of an hour or more, then automatically rate it as difficult. And if it's less than an hour but has over 6 servings, we'll call it moderate. So we see that we're returning value of 3, we're returning a value of 2, or returning a value of 1 to rate the recipe as complex, moderate, or simple. And so you're going to need to take a look at how to complete this line 7 requirement in order to rate it based on the number of ingredients in the recipe. Any questions from all of the really actually very challenging topics that we're touching on today?
So we need to update, sorry, not on the topics, but on the homework. We need to update that helper class and bulkify it in order to call it in the trigger that we're creating, right? Is that correct?
Well, let's take a look. We want to rate the complexity of the recipe by checking the recipe before it's inserted and calling out to rate the recipe complexity. The method exists. We want to get the numerical rating back from it. And yeah, right now it's not complete. So you can count it a win if you get your code to work and haven't completed that, but it would be great if you could take the to-do and also complete that to-do of consider the number of ingredients and rate the complexity based on what that number is. And there's already a test class. So let's take a look actually at that week 4 homework check. Because in my opinion, the best test classes help us to understand what the code is trying to do. So in our test class, week 4 homework check, we have a method called test required values positive. We have a method called test required values negative, test complexity positive, and what else do we have? Test review task positive. So hopefully these are corresponding to the actual different things that we're adding, right? We're creating a method that checks for missing key values. We're calling out to the rate the complexity. We're creating those new tasks based on the state of the recipe as draft. Each of those things shows up in the test class as a separate test method. If I were to run this test method currently, I don't have a trigger, everything should fail. And test-driven development tells me that that's exactly where I want to start, with failing tests and then make them pass. So where's my week 4? Oh, I have one that actually passes. Look at that. Test required values negative is already passing. Woohoo! Homework's partly done. So next up, pick one of the assignments and see if you can get that test passing by changing the way the trigger works and the way the helper functions work if necessary. This should be the only part of the helper function that needs to be changed. In the real world, if you're refactoring code, there could be an existing test. And likewise, you would want to go through and say, okay, we have some new circumstances that are causing our test to fail. I need to refactor my code to make the test pass. And that's when you go in and update your triggers and do the things that need to be done in order to make those existing tests pass. Sometimes we take a different approach and find that we have not got good tests for our existing code, and we have to rewrite the test or write new tests before we can even start writing code in test-driven development. But in this case, you've got great tests, and so you should expect to see these passing once you get your trigger set up the way you want, the trigger and the trigger handler that you're creating. So if we're creating a trigger related to the recipe S object, what would be the first thing that you would recommend that I do? I should call on somebody. Shanae, what would be the first thing that you recommend if I need to create a trigger that operates on the recipe object?
Okay, so it's been a while since I've looked at triggers. I'm still catching up on my homework, but I would guess that it would you would want to identify if you're going to do have the trigger go before, or when you're going to have the trigger run. Is it before update, after update, or whatever all the other options are that I can't think of off the top of my head, but when that trigger will run.
Yeah, that's a really great suggestion, to figure out what the trigger contexts are. I can double check. I don't currently have a trigger for recipe in my code base, so probably just coming to command palette and looking for create Apex trigger. I think if I type in trigger, it pops right to the top. Probably follow this naming convention. So I think it's going to be recipe trigger. I don't need to put the dot part, so I'll let it go and put it where it needs to be. Did it? Yes, there we go. Finally, it popped up and it opened it up and it tells me that it is called recipe trigger. It doesn't know what object it's going on, so I have to put that in. I suspect it's, oh, there it is, recipe _ C. And it pre-populates with before insert, but I think we also had a task for before update, so I can double check that, but awesome. Now, as Janae was saying, figure out the context, but now I need my conditionals to determine what context we are and call the right behavior based on that context. So probably start with an if trigger is before. And trigger dot is insert. And I think I can do or upsert. Is update. Then I'm gonna do a thing that I can't do yet because I haven't written any other code. So now I'm stuck. I've got my trigger started. I think I've started it right. I think it's going to be before insert or before update. And I think it's got to call some other code. So before insert, oh, after insert also, before update and after update. Okay, so we need more context, and we need a utility class that will be called by the trigger to handle the business logic. And some of that business logic is to have a method to look for those missing values. So, gee, let me see. I'm going to call on Chong to tell me what should I do if I know that I need to create a utility class.
You need to create a new class that can be called into this trigger class.
Yeah, so this will be a class as opposed to that my trigger can call. So I need, instead of Apex trigger, I need Apex class. We can't call triggers. So none of the code in my trigger is ever reusable, but the code in my classes can be called by other classes. And I think I'm just going to call it recipe utility, because for me, I will know what that means. And I think I'm not going to have a constructor because I don't have any reason to get or set values yet. I'll figure that out as I go along. But I probably need a method to start with, and I need to call it from my trigger, so I need to make it public. And I'll try to make it static. And what are we returning? Does it tell us what we're returning? Check if it is missing key values for the following. Well, I'm not 100% sure what it wants me to do once I've checked. That might be explained further down, or maybe I just need to return a Boolean true or false for now. So let's go ahead and, not a Boolean, a Boolean. And I'm probably going to have to pass in a list of recipes. That I get from my trigger, I suspect. And then I'm probably going to need to iterate through those recipes one at a time. Oh, I have a typo here. Look at that. And I should give it a variable name. I'm going to call it recipe list because that's what I do. So now I can step through that for, I don't know if this is right, y'all. This is just the way I would start it. And then I might get halfway down the road and go, hey, I'm doing this totally wrong. I've totally misread what they're asking me to do. And this is complete garbage and I have to throw it away. That happens. But I wanted to kind of walk through the thought process and get you all considering how to approach a problem, because putting something down is always the first step, even if it's completely wrong, for me anyway. And I'm okay with being wrong. My code's wrong a lot of times. I spend a lot of time fixing things that don't work the way I wanted them to. So I'm going to loop through each recipe, calling it R, and that is in my recipe list. And I'm going to do something when I loop through it. I don't know what yet. And then at some point, in order to save this, I'm going to need to return a Boolean value. Oops.
Why would we want, just like if we were building this, not as a homework assignment, why would we want to have a separate utility class doing this logic and this for loop instead of just including it in the handler class?
I don't have a handler class. I could have called this recipe handler.
Oh, so this would be, it's basically the same thing.
Yeah.
I was actually going to ask about a naming convention because I've seen, helper, utility,
Yeah.
handler.
I would
Is it
say
just preference?
do whatever is in the org that you're working in. And if it's your personal org, do what makes you happy and that you can follow and talk about and remember.
Okay.
Right. Or do what's hard for you and stretch yourself and challenge yourself. I mean, they're both valid approaches. If you've seen a naming convention that's not comfortable for you and you want to give it a try, absolutely give it a try and decide the merits or problems that you see with it.
I
Because
thought they had like different
Usually-
functions or like different purposes. So
well,
that makes sense though.
Yeah, usually handler and helper are interchangeable. So you'd usually see a helper class as a handler class. And utility is more of encompassing business logic that's repeatable. So a handler will call a utility or a helper will call a utility. So that's usually how I think about it. But if you see 3 in your org, it just depends on what it's doing. Sometimes people will also use a utility as a handler as well.
Okay.
so handler handles the business logic and utilities are reusable utilities that handle business logic. And so that's why you'll find that sort of interchangeability, and you'll probably find the thing that I despise finding is 2 or more classes named utility.class in your org, because that managed package has a utility class and your custom code has a utility class, and nobody named it for what kind of utilities are in it. They just named it utility class and assumed they would have the only one because nobody else is creating utility classes. Don't let that be you. Any other? Yep.
Can I ask you some other questions?
Absolutely.
Because like for me, like static and non-static is like most agonizing concept still, because I think you mentioned earlier that, like you will understand why they choose to use static or instances. And I think
Sometimes,
to
not
choose
always.
and I think it's come with the experience, I assume. And I want to see if you go back to the global class. I forgot the name of it. From the one of the sample, there was a global class. Sorry, from the VS Code. That from your VS Code, there was a global class that categorized into different rating. Sorry, I forgot which one that was.
The helper function?
Helper function, yes. It used static. If it's not hard, can you show us your logic of why you decided to use static?
This is not my code. This is
yes, I understand.
This is right. So in this case, we are adding functionality to the recipe object that the recipe object doesn't currently have. And so we're expecting to have a recipe passed to us that we can then rate the complexity of. If we were building a class that had properties and methods associated with it, and that class represented something about recipes, we might want that to be an instance method, but we don't have that control. We have to get the data from elsewhere. So that makes a great static method that we're just saying, here's a method, you can run it with helper functions dot rate recipe complexity, pass in the recipe you want to have this happen to, and we will give you back an integer. Yeah, again, if it were something that maybe I was getting the data from an integration and I wanted to complete it before passing it into Salesforce, then maybe my code actually sets up the recipe data and has the ability to rate its complexity all in a class that has, the recipe as a property and the rate recipe complexity as a method. And then it can create the recipe object and rate the complexity and add that to the recipe that we've got for each recipe that we get from this integration. But instead, we're pulling the data out of Salesforce. So makes sense to say, let somebody pass us that data and we'll just do work with that data and give them back an integer. Does that help?
I will rewatch the video. There's a lot of puzzling.
Yeah, I was going to say, for the short of it, if you think about it this way, the work that its method is doing is not changing. It's just acting on the data. So we're saying make this static, because no matter what recipe you pass in, the work itself doesn't change too much. There's just a couple if statements every recipe is running through. And so that's why this can be static.
Right. It seems like the method, the business logic, calling for this is like a last step.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we don't need to change that business logic every time. We just need to pass in a recipe.
Right.
And because it's static, we can call that class, and that you call the class and then use dot notation to call the method instead of making that initial copy, which is really good.
Yeah, and one of the examples that also was given was, if you're querying a data, a static method may be better or something like that too. Yeah.
Well,
thank you.
you're going to fetch the data, so you're not acting on anything yet. You don't necessarily have an instance of anything. So yeah, that makes sense. Good call. Awesome. Do we have other questions? We've gone over with our look at the homework together, and hopefully that was good.
Just really
start.
quickly.
Mhm.
Sorry, about the gist. How do we put everything in, all the different files into one gist?
Oh yeah, awesome. Good question. Let me see. What have I got open here? All kinds of different things. So if I come here and do my plus sign does a new gist, I can create a new gist, and I'm going to give it a description, multi-file. This is not code, but that's okay. I can actually, before I save this, I've got this file set up. It has one line. I've got my gist set up with a descriptor. I can add another file here. And I think I pressed that. Yeah. So it's waiting for me to name this one, and this one's going to be file 2. It's also not code right now. If I give it a .cls, then it will try to make it look like code and do some colorizing for me to make it read, appear a little bit more like code. Really handy when you're looking at things like Apex and Java. And then I can create my secret gist and share that URL by coming over here and doing a share, get a copyable link. I can put that in chat, except I can't see the chat for some reason. It's hiding chat from me. I keep trying to tell it to show me the chat, but it won't, so I can't share. Sorry. Other questions, comments, concerns?
I think the homework about the first one, checking the fields, I think it's wanting us to prevent people missing those values because those are needed in the later on. So maybe I don't know, add error or something will be better.
Let's take a look at what the test class wants from you, because that's a good call. Okay, if we look at our test class, we had a task positive. No. I think it was the very first method. Test required values. Oops, sorry. For anyone who can't stay on, feel free to drop at any time and watch the video, but I'm happy to stay and answer questions for a bit. We have our test required values positive method here, and in order to run it, we are creating a new recipe and inserting it, and then we query for the inserted recipe, and we assert that the inserted recipe draft. Let's see, what are we asserting here? We're getting our inserted recipe. We're looking at the draft field and making sure that the draft field is true. And if the draft field is not true, then we display an error message. So I guess we're preventing a recipe from being saved in any way other than draft if it's missing fields. And for our required values negative, again, creating a recipe. In this case, we're putting in the required fields and saving it. The first one we did not put in, so our trigger is going to need to make sure that when they're missing fields, then draft must be true. When all the fields are handy and there, then draft is false. Otherwise, we throw an error in our system assert. I love good tests that tell me what the code should be doing. Other questions, concerns? I have all kinds of things wrong with my code that I was putting together here. I'm missing my closing paren, it thinks. Yes. Oops. That was supposed to be Control S to try to save again. There we go. That cleared that one up. And the only failure I've got now is when I ran the week 4 homework and I got an assertion failure that popped up here. The others are warnings from Apex PMD code scanner. Any other questions, concerns, comments? If not, thank you all for your patience and staying on and exploring a little bit further today, and look forward to seeing your homework, hearing your comments as you're working through it, and seeing you all next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.